Let me think. Long enough so that the days are beginning to run together like goulash. But I know exactly where I am right now. It's been about 3 weeks. It was, to me, it was unusual to go to the Jimmy Carter Museum in Atlanta and find out that it's so big you need directions just how to get to, I'd never seen the Presidential Library before. I think it's a very good point. I look at my own work, and there's something about those early works like the Candy-Colored Tangerine Flake Streamlined Baby, which is a collection, also the Pump House Gang, which was a collection. And there's something a little juvenile about them, but there's also that juvenile spirit that you can't beat. It's hard to keep it up later on. I felt like I didn't learn to write in any sophisticated sense until I wrote Radical Chic. But I look back at some of those things and think, gosh, wasn't it great to be young? I doubt that. He started, everything proceeds from his statement, God is dead, in which he said is not in a declaration of atheism, although he was an atheist. And incidentally, probably the first atheist in philosophy. Even David Hume, who probably didn't believe in God, would never say so. But that was about 1882, and I think he went into his, what became a madness about 1890. So I think he was thinking clearly. Well, I wish I could get the royalties from my namesake, Thomas Wolfe, who, of course, wrote You Can't Go Home Again. If anybody's ever nice enough to compliment me for my work, I always skip 2 or 3 beats and to find out if they're talking about Thomas Wolfe of Asheville, North Carolina, or they're talking about me. It happens a lot. Actually, I should just love, to be mistaken for him. I admire his work extravagantly, but I can't pull that off. He was born in 1900, died in 1938, far, far too young, 38 years old, died of tuberculosis of the spine, which invaded the brain. Absolutely, when I was old enough to read names, I don't know how old that was, probably 9. No, it was a little before that. There were some Thomas Wolfe books. It was Look Homeward Angel and The Web and the Rock were on the shelf in my parents' home. And they just could not convince me that I was not kin to this man, particularly since he was from the same mountain range or valleys that my father was from. And I just claimed him. In fact, his family really had no E on the end until his father, who did statuary for graveyards, made a sign. He says, I think that would look better with an E on the end. So he just put an E on the end. No, I didn't. I stayed away from Duke and doing research because my daughter really, I'm sure, I didn't ask her point blank, wanted her old man creeping around the campus with a notebook and a ballpoint pen. So as far as I know, I did visit her, of course, but as far as I know, Duke is a noble exception to everything that appears in that book. In any case, I have a son who's a sophomore in college at Trinity College in Hartford, and I have consummate faith in the two of them. I'm very proud of them. I would say just about I can tick them off. Stanford, I started on the West Coast. Stanford, then went to the University of Michigan. Then I went short, I stayed there a month at a time. And then some short visits to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Penn. Then another month at Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina. And finally, about 3 weeks at the University of Florida in Gainesville. And the occasional little short trip to some place where I heard some interesting manifestation had been exhibited or occurring. So I tried to get a fairly wide spectrum, private universities like Stanford, public universities like Michigan or Florida. I started off in 1999. That's when I went to Stanford. And I stayed at a place called the Garden Court Hotel, because it's very near the campus, and not realizing that it was the power breakfast scene of the Silicon Valley. And you'd see, I was seeing billionaires come in the door. I'm not kidding. There had been 14 billionaires created in the Silicon Valley in the preceding 12 months. They're billionaires because their stock was worth more than $1 billion. I was there at the high tide just before the whole bubble broke and so on. So I got a kind of a 2-for-1. I got a good look at Stanford and also at the Silicon Valley tribe. Well, there really is, so many people have thought that this novel is about Duke because my daughter went there. And there is Gothic architecture, as Duke has, which narrows it down, I think, to about 272 American universities. And there's a very strong basketball program, it has been for years. And that narrows it down to about 23 American universities. So it really wasn't, it really wasn't Duke. It's an amalgam. I've taken things from, like the term dormcest, which refers to somebody having an affair or hookup with, let's say, some guy with a girl in his own dormitory. That's considered pathetic. That's really lame. It's like incest, so they call it dormcest. Now that came from Stanford, and this place is near Chester, right up against Chester, Pennsylvania. So there really is. There's a little bit of every place I went to. Yes, I did. My sister Helen discovered it for me. It's in Allegheny County, way up in the northwestern part of North Carolina, in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And that county was always called the Lost Province because it was so hard to get to it, and people were still pretty large mountain people living of them. Now there are highways that come into Sparta, but it still has a lovely air of remoteness about it. It's absolutely gorgeous mountain country. So I decided I'd place this in Sparta because I wanted my central figure, Charlotte Simmons, this 18-year-old genius, but a naive genius, to come from some place where it would be plausible that she was unaffected by many, many contemporary currents of the lowland. And, I mean, in Sparta, there's not even a movie theater. There are no stockbrokers. There are no businessmen wearing dark suits and interesting neckties. There's almost nobody there who gets caught up in college mania, which is the fervent disease of our times, to get your children into prestigious colleges. And then the parents don't care what happens to the children when they get into these colleges, incidentally. I once had the opportunity to talk to some Harvard seniors. And I didn't mean to get into this, but all of a sudden I heard myself saying, gosh, I'm really glad to meet you. And I come from a city, New York, where families are rated, well, according to whether or not their children went to Harvard. And I said, but I never heard a single parent, not one, this is true too, ever show any curiosity about what they were like while at Harvard or what they were like when they got out. So here were some seniors about to graduate, and I said, gosh, and there's my opportunity to find out, your parents don't care, but I'm kind of interested as to what you're like. Today it's all getting in. It's getting into that right college. It'll make the family look good. Washington Lee was all male. You know, at that time, a co-ed college was very rare. University of Virginia, the males occupied that beautiful Jeffersonian quadrangles and rotundas and all that beautiful architecture in Charlottesville. The female branch was called Mary Washington. It was 100 miles away in Fredericksburg, Virginia. That was the norm in those days. 1951. I kind of agree with G.K. Chesterton. You know, back in 1912, G.K. Chesterton said, "I keep hearing about coeducation, and everybody says it's a great idea." He said, "But I've never heard an argument for it. He said, it's not that I haven't heard a good argument, I haven't heard any argument. And that's the way co-education in colleges developed in this country. There was no debate. It just occurred. There was no debate over co-ed bathrooms. I mean, I would have absolutely shriveled with injured modesty if I'd ever had to be in a co-ed bathroom. I can't imagine that there's 2 girls out of 100 who actually enjoy it, but it's sort of the thing. What is the advantage of a co-ed bathroom? I mean, what earthly advantage? It's not everywhere, but it's quite common. It's very common. In some of them, there are what used to be male bathrooms, and there'll be a series of shower nozzles coming out of the wall, no partitions, no curtains, and boys and girls are taking showers. And I went to Brown with a friend of mine who had a daughter there, and this is before I got started working on this, and the daughter showed him the bathroom, and he says, well, the father says, where's the men's bathroom? And she said, oh, no, everyone's in the same place. And the father was shocked and said, that must be, isn't that embarrassing? And she said, well, it is a little bit. So when I take a shower, I go to that shower way down there because after everyone's in there, the steam is rising, and it kind of creates a screen. So the whole rest of the tour of the campus, I could hear her father muttering under his breath. It kind of creates a screen, trying to work this out in his mind, justify it, you know. I think it's number 13, if you count The New Journalism, which was an anthology to which I was going to write a 3-page introduction, and I wrote 75 pages. So. Depends on whether you're talking about volume or critical judgment. The volume I can't complain about. There's been a lot of publicity. That's fine. Now, critically, it's been an odd situation, odd to me. Now, I always assume that when I get a bad review, that the person means it. I mean, you can't walk up to a review and say, you didn't mean that. You really like that book. But several of the, I mean, there have been a lot of what I consider great reviews, but in the negative ones, there's 2 that, as I recall, that made the point, you can't put this book down, but then you hate yourself for having picked it up. Somehow that amuses me. I think they probably, you know, photographers will take so many photographs that after a while you get tired of keeping the same pose. I also wanted people to see the gold in my teeth. I don't know if you can see it, but there's quite a bit of it. And that's very unfashionable now. People go for porcelain, but I think it's ridiculous. I think gold in your mouth is great stuff. And if one of these teeth would go, I'd put in a gold one. Yeah, that was a mistake to wear that hat. But that's all right. We're getting down to fine points of style now. It happened by accident, but I realized pretty soon that I was onto a good thing. I'd finally gotten a job in New York as a reporter. I'd been on 2 previous papers, including the Washington Post. Finally got this job. It was June of 1962. Summer was coming on. In those days, as a reporter, I had to wear a jacket and a tie. Today, reporters look like they're all waiting in a soup kitchen line, but then you had to have, and I had only 2 jackets to my name. So I went into a store and I bought a white suit for the summer, which in Richmond, Virginia, was where I grew up. It was not an odd thing, but it was made of some heavy material, silk tweed, and I couldn't wear it in the summer, so I started wearing it in about this time of year. It was conventionally cut, but it was white, and this annoyed people no end. Now, why I enjoyed that, I don't know, but it made getting dressed in the morning a lot more fun than it had been. And then when finally I wrote or rather, I published a collection, the Candy-Colored Tangerine Flake Streamlined Baby, of magazine pieces I'd done. I discovered I was not used to being interviewed. I was always interviewing somebody else, and I was kind of speechless. And these people asked me these questions, my opinions and stuff, and I didn't really say very much, but all the articles would say, "What an interesting man, he wears white suits." So it took the place of a personality for many years. I used to have a lot of them, but I've got about 22 now. I can get by with that. That's 6 hours. When you to go on a trip and make people think you have one, you have to have three. And I have 3 suits I brought along to come here, all made of the same material. You can't really tell the difference. But you know, it simply has not hurt to have a trademark. I have them made in New York, but there's a tailor named, and I like to give the tailors names, Vincent Nicolosi. He's Italian, but been in this country a long time. I'm just worried about where the new tailors are going to come from, but it's 510 Madison Avenue, if anybody listening would like to get a really nice suit. This I would call the last frontier in clothes. One time I bought a pair of spats, and they looked great, but spats were made for an era with no central heating, and they make your ankles and your feet really hot. Usually they're made of felt. So I found a shoemaker who would make me what the equivalent of the spats looked. I call them faux spats, F-A-U-X spats. I've really been surprised that the shoemakers haven't picked up on this, but they haven't. 1965. Well, these were all articles I had done since '63. And I had written them in 1963, 1964, mostly for the New York Magazine, which was then part of the New York Herald Tribune, and then Esquire. So it's really those 2 magazines. The New York Herald Tribune, which I had started working for, went on strike about 6 months after I got there. I suddenly had to make a living on my own. So I remembered this custom car show at the Coliseum in New York. And I wrote a little piece about the custom car show on a daily basis. I'd never heard of customized cars. So then I went out to California and actually went to see people like George Barris, who was he's one of the legendary names in car customizing, or Ed Roth, Ed Big Daddy Roth was another. And I ran into people like Ronnie Camp and a lot of others. And that was, these pieces, I didn't think of it that way at the time. All these pieces in that book, the Candy-Colored Tangerine Flake Streamlined Baby, are about the way life, particularly among young people, started changing in the '60s. Suddenly there was money in the air, and people like Ronnie Camp, who as I say, I don't really know his background, but I doubt if he came from a wealthy background, had the money somehow to make these cars and really customize them, chop the roofs down. The dual exhaust coming through the bumper is something they came up with. Detroit eventually took over so many of the style changes that these young men had made that it really became hard to be creative, because Detroit was just taking one after another after another. But this was typical of the '60s, in which there was suddenly money in the air that enabled teenagers to create lives of their own. Later I wrote about, for example, a piece called The Pump House Gang in the next book, about a group of surfers who had a commune in La Jolla, California. They lived apart from their parents, who all lived in La Jolla, and their life was built around surfing. This had never happened in this country before, in which the young somehow could find the money to create lives, you know, separate from adults. And I guess part of the kind of juice, if I may use that term, of that book, even though there's some juvenile things about it, came from just discovering the way life was changing in the 1960s. I mean, the changes in life in the 1960s at home, I think, had a bigger impact on the United States than the war in Vietnam, frankly. It came out in magazine form in 1997, but it wasn't published in book form until 2000, and a collection called Hooking Up. I think the audio version sold better than the book version, partly because it was a wonderful actor, Edward Norton, read the piece for the audio, and there are a lot of regional accents in that piece. It would be certainly worth one. That was originally going to be part of A Man in Full. There was going to be there was going to be so many things in A Man in Full that I would still be working on if I'd followed through all the ideas that I had, and it gave me a chance. I did quite a little bit of research as to how they run these sting programs on television, whether it's the 60 Minutes Sting or 2020 has done them, where the subject finds out toward the end of the segment that somebody burst from behind a curtain and, hey, we're 60 Minutes. It always intrigued me, so I built a story around it. The piece is called Ambush at Fort Bragg, and television people actually call it an ambush when they pull off a sting operation. They surprise the subject and get the subject to say, well, sometimes incriminating things, as they did in this novella, Ambush at Fort Bragg. Let's see, it was 1980. For the first time in my life, I had a financial cushion thanks to the book The Right Stuff, which was also made into a movie. And I was going to do a nonfiction novel about New York City after the model of Thackeray's Vanity Fair. And that's when I heard of a party that Leonard Bernstein and his wife Felicia were going to give for the Black Panther Party in their penthouse duplex on Park Avenue at 79th Street in New York. And I said, well, this might make a chapter in this nonfiction novel. But I went to the event, and it was so extraordinary that the old fire bell rang in the journalist's head, and so I wrote it immediately. I couldn't resist. And then I said, well, gee, why don't I think about writing a novel? I don't want to finish my career and then look back and say, gee, I wonder what would have happened if I ever tried the novel. And I knew there were lots of people who were saying that this new journalism, it was called, was just an extravagant way it's an extravagant form of writer's block. Well, those guys really have a complicated way of not facing the big one, which is the novel. So then I decided to do it as a novel, The Bonfire of the Vanities. But I quickly found that for me, now this is obviously not true for most other novelists, for me it was necessary to go out and do reporting just of the same sort I had done for a book like The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, just spending endless amounts of time with what I now thought of as hippies, or like The Right Stuff, for that matter, with which I went all over the country interviewing astronauts who had retired. And it wasn't much of a shift in that sense. The one thing it is possible to do in fiction is to be economical. Looking at the thickness of my books, you wouldn't think so, but there's an economy in being able to put several traits into one character, or to have things happen in a dramatic form, and when life doesn't always happen, in a dramatic form. I still, though, believe that nonfiction was the great step forward in American literature in the second half of the 20th century. That's true. The Painted Word, which was about nonfiction, about the world of art, as I call it, the art village in New York, which was a brief history of modernism, and I was very happy when lots of artists squawked over that book. It's a lot. I think it's a lot easier to cover government because you have all sorts of people in place to give you information. It's much easier to do that than to really dig to find out how certain things start, exactly what's going on. I think, and to the extent that that's true, it's sloth. It's just laziness. And then once people start depending on any particular source in government, or for that matter anywhere else, they begin to feel like, well, I can't really knock this institution or this person because I'll have to go to them again for more information. I think it's as simple as that. Well, it was all based on things that had happened, including I'd run into a lot of Reverend Bacons who would get into poverty program projects simply for the money, government money that was to be had. There were lots of Sherman McCoys already in place when I wrote about him as a bonds salesman. I had, in a way, the most fun seeing how the judicial system operates and the motivations of prosecutors. I mean, prosecutors keep score and how many victories they have, and prosecutors will be like the most ambitious or competitive athlete you've ever seen in your life. They're going to win. They're going to win that game. So I think, you know, we're in a period right now that isn't that much, really isn't that much different. No, I realized that I was going to be 50 years older than all the people I interviewed, but I took this to be a reporting challenge more than anything else. I mean, I was on a different wavelength from the hippies, on a different wavelength from the pilots and the right stuff for that matter. And I found that it was surprisingly easy to get close to students because they love to tell you about their lives because they realize that their lives are something different in American history. I actually didn't realize how much work was going to be involved, but at the time it wasn't. I didn't find it intimidating. My daughter is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. She got out of college in 2002, and she has. I'm so proud of her. I'm glad you read it. She has a book contract now and she'll take a leave from the Wall Street Journal to write a book on, well, in a general sense, on American youth, which has the title American Coddle. Now, I try not to let that happen, although, frankly, there's more than a little bit of me in Charlotte Simmons in this book. Her ambition, which she doesn't realize is not specifically for the life of the mind that she keeps talking about. She's going to leave the Blue Ridge Mountains and go to this great university to experience the life of the mind. But what she really wants is stardom. And I was like that at that age. You know, I was a baseball player, and it turned out, it took me years to learn this, but I wasn't a very good one. But I played in high school. I played for Washington and Lee. I played in the semi-pro leagues for 2 years, always waiting to be discovered. I have a feeling that if somebody had offered me a Class D contract, I would have gladly taken it and never written a word. I mean, that's, you know, what does that say about me? I guess it's that, above all, I wanted to be a star. I was a pitcher and a third baseman, mostly a pitcher. I'm 5'11" and a half. Charlie was a developer who was riding high. He had a plantation, the kind of place that has about 25,000 acres and is devoted exclusively to shooting quail 13 weeks out of the year. He is toward the end of the 80s. He's overreaching terribly. He doesn't know when to pull in his investments, and he's essentially bankrupt when the book begins. And that was a very typical story in real estate development in the early 90s. And he had shucked his first wife of some 37 years and had taken up with his new cookie. And he had I tried to show all the problems that are attendant upon that decision that some men make when they consider themselves really fabulous achievers. You know, at that point they figure, well, they have the right to shuck the old wife and get a new one that's preferably in her 20s, you know, preferably blonde, as in the phrase the lemon tart, which came out of that particular era. What was interesting was that not just John Updike, but also Norman Mailer and John Irving, these three old men with secure literary reputations, suddenly pounced on a novel by somebody else. I do not think anything remotely like that had ever happened. And what you just quoted from Updike was a typical, the tenor of these three attacks, which was that, you know, this is not literature, this is journalism, this is entertainment, that charge doesn't bother me at all. I'm trying to put together a Hippocratic oath for writers. I guess it would be sort of an Aristophanic oath. You know, the Hippocratic oath begins, first, do no harm. I think that's really interesting, that the oath for doctors is first, do no harm. The Aristophanic oath for writers, the one I'm putting together, says, first, entertain. Entertain is a very simple definition. Entertainment is something that enables a person to pass the time pleasantly without physical effort. Is that too much to expect of something that's written and offered to people to read? I don't think so. You at least do that, then you can soar to the stratosphere if you have the talent. But first, entertain. And these novels had become so unentertaining that they just didn't like the fact that this book, A Man in Full, had sold 1.4 million copies in hardcover. You know, that couldn't be literature if it sold that much. In that case, I'm not sure whether it played a part, because there's nothing political about A Man in Full, so they couldn't really cite. In the New York journalistic and literary worlds, it does not help to even have any inklings of conservatism. People always call me conservative, and I say, okay, what's my agenda? It's mostly that I have made fun of things that are sacred. I was at a dinner party before the election, and everybody at the table is a journalist or a writer of some sort. And they were all talking about, what can we do to stop George Bush? They were flattering themselves, you know, we write, we can influence the vote. And I didn't say a word, because my father always told me, never talk about religion or politics at the dinner table. But finally somebody turned to me and said, well, Tom, what do you think we can do about Bush? And I said, well, if all else fails, you can vote for him. Well, the reaction, I think, tells you a lot. Nobody guffawed, nobody rolled their eyes, and nobody objected verbally in any way at all. They all looked at me in this strange way, and I realized it was the look I would have gotten if I had suddenly said, oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you all, I'm a child molester. And you know, what do you do if some guy at the table says, I'm a child molester? Dial 911? What do you, I mean, but that was their reaction. It's just lockstep liberalism. Geraldo Rivera. Well, actually, where would he fit in? You mean as along the lines of the journalist who was in the book, Peter Fallow? I mean, there may have been somebody mentioned, but it wouldn't be somebody on the scene right now. It might be a historical. I was thinking it was a kind of a generic depiction of the British journalists who have come to the U.S. They're not all like Peter Fallow, but I think enough are that it was accurate. In other words, I'm going to get in more trouble now, but they really don't like this country. They consider it backward socially and backward intellectually, and they consider it this lucky country that has all these natural resources, and they're here to kind of pick the last white meat off the bones of capitalism. And they also they're very prone to having other people entertain them and pick up the check and invite them for the weekend, and they stay a month. Now, I shouldn't say it, because I take it all back, actually, but there is a type. This book is from the viewpoint of undergraduates, and naturally teachers come into the picture, but only as they are viewed by the undergraduates. I felt that there were a lot of very good faculty novels, for example, and there are a lot of books that have come out, particularly in the last 10 years, that have dwelt upon the whole problem of educational bureaucracy, the tenor of faculties. Oddly enough, there's right now there is students and faculty are passing like ships in the night. It's the faculties that become fervent about the subject of political correctness. The students hardly notice. There may be 10% of the student body who's vocal on that subject, but they'll just parrot whatever the teacher says, do it rather cynically, grind out a credit in a course. That's what I've noticed much more than administrative bureaucracy. That is true. I guess that's why it popped into my head. In Radical Chic, and this was, of course, nonfiction, so there was such a man. Leon Quat was one of the people who organized the evening that Leonard Bernstein and his wife Felicia organized, in the evening in which they entertained the Black Panthers in their Park Avenue apartment. Oh, yes. I had been actually visiting my wife-to-be at Harper's Magazine, was just hanging around. She was busy. And I wandered into the office of David Halberstam, to be specific. He wasn't there. And I shouldn't have been poking around, but I noticed this invitation on his desk to this party that Leonard Bernstein and his wife were giving for the Black Panthers. And I said to myself, that's bizarre. So there was a phone number on this invitation. So I jotted it down and I called up and I said, I'm Tom Wolfe and I accept. Well, fortunately, it was probably just somebody sitting there with a yellow pad and writing down the people who accepted the invitation. And when I got to their apartment, there was a little security check at the door, but my name was on the list, so I went right on in. And I did what my mother always told me to do. I introduced myself to my hosts. I think they did. I'm pretty sure they did, because I'd been writing a lot by that time for New York Magazine and Esquire. And I think they assumed if I'd gone to the trouble of being there, I must be for the Panthers. And so I really had the run of the place, and I took notes very openly, a pad with a ballpoint pen. And there were a couple of other journalists there, one from the style section of the New York Times. The Bernsteins resented that tremendously. They wanted someone like Homer Biggert from the National Desk to cover this party. I did tell him But I felt that wasn't too awful a violation of confidence to, it's just an invitation after all. Anyway, I went, and it was just an extraordinary evening. Here was Barbara Walters was there and defending herself for not wanting the Panthers to necessarily triumph, and so on. Otto Preminger was there. He was one who he defied the Panthers. I remember him saying, he'd asked one of them a question about something, and Otto Preminger says, "That's your problem. You don't read anything. You don't know what's going on." Nobody else spoke back. There were just three. No, three plus 2 or 3 wives, and they were pretty vocal too, the wives. So I guess altogether there were 6 from that. This was a fundraiser. This was a fundraiser, and the aforementioned Leon Quiet was in charge of raising the money. And I remember he kept saying, "This is not tax deductible, so this is the real thing. This is real commitment. You can't deduct this from your taxes." That was a kind of a talking point. Who has no, I just like the name. I don't know why. I personally don't think that's what happened. I don't recall any sort of organized protests, let's say, that of the sort that there had been on the left. In a way, the Republicans have, and conservatives generally, have just tapped into a set of beliefs that were already there. They didn't have. They merely had to be awakened and appealed to. For example, it always cracks me up when I hear people going on and on about the religious right. These people aren't on the right. They're just religious, and this whole country was religious up until the Second World War. By which I mean, if you had any pretensions to being assistant manager of the feed store or better, you went to church or some religious institution on the weekend. And if you didn't believe, you acted like you believed. I grew up among these people. That was what America was made of. De Tocqueville said this was the most religious nation on earth outside of the nations of Islam. And that has been true. This has been an extremely religious nation. And this so-called rise of the evangelical Christians, it's not a rise. They were all there. And all the Republicans had to do, I don't think they knew what they were doing exactly, is to somehow encourage these natural feelings. So it's not. They didn't tilt to the right or to the left. That's America, believe it or not. I believe that, I live in New York City, and I've just been to the West Coast, and they talk about the blue states. I don't think they're the blue states. They are parentheses, and between these two parentheses is America. God-fearing, hard-working people. At Michigan, I did go to a lot of fraternity parties. I did more visiting of residential colleges at Stanford, as it turned out, but also at University of North Carolina. And I kept trying to find some record of the debate over these co-ed bathrooms or just co-ed college, for that matter, and it never existed. It was really really interesting, and I'm not surprised to hear you say that you left until you waited until the girls left the bathroom. I experienced something very close. Yeah, I certainly was. Fortunately, I was old enough so that nobody was going to think I was from the Drug Enforcement Agency or anything like that. If I thought that everybody knew who I was, I had a jarring surprise coming. A few people did, but mostly there's this old guy walking around. They were usually in a pretty amiable frame of mind by the time I walked in. Oh, practically I would say practically everybody, but there is no more drinking today, I'm convinced, than there was in my day or there was in the 19th century. I mean, my sister Helen did some research for the University of North Carolina for a documentary they put out on their 300th anniversary. And she found records of drunken students assassinating a professor that they just didn't like. Now, I hadn't heard of anything like that in the current age of so-called binge drinking. Binge drinking is a new name, but it's been around for a long, long time. That phenomenon actually, I would say, began with the success of Rush Limbaugh. And again, it wasn't that he was a persuasive person so much as there finally was an outlet for people of what is now called a conservative frame of mind. Often these things that are called conservative are just simply American. And it shows a tremendous, it shows the tremendous split between what I would call the above the BA line, that is people who have a bachelor's degree or better, and the rest of the country, and between those who really do not no longer believe in religion. I'm not religious myself, but I see this going on, and those who do, and those who do maintain religious beliefs, and it's a huge part of the country, have not had a way to make their views on particularly these so-called social issues heard or felt. They sell, and I mean, I shouldn't dismiss them, but like so many people in New York, I live a little over my head, and I have to keep working, frankly. No, it's a good income, but it's not a tremendous income. I mean, I'm sure there are writers who have that kind of. Which one sells the most? I don't know whether now it'd be, all told, I guess it would be. You were talking about me or the Bonfire, the Vanities, and the Man in Full. The Man in Full actually sold more in hardcover than the Bonfire of the Vanities, and the numbers were very large. And those would be the two. It's on East 79th Street in New York, near Madison Avenue. It's at home. I walk about 25 feet each morning to my office. Let me think. 14 years. 14 years. And what you're looking at right now, that's my study, and I hope you can see the hat lampshades that I have. It was done by a woman named Ruth. Why can't I think of her last name? But that's what she does, custom lampshades. That's the desk, and that desk is, if you don't mind me saying so, absolutely fabulous. It's an electrified desk. The style is more or less 170 years old, I would say, Regency England period, but it's totally electrified. When I moved in 1990 from another place, I discovered there were all these wires hanging off of my desk. So I said, I'm going to electrify this. Oh, did you see the radio right there? That is a radio with the wiring built into the desk, and it has, it's a radio from a 1977 Cadillac, because the 77 Cadillac had fake mahogany knobs on the radio. That's my typewriter, and I tried the computer word processor for 2 years working on this book. And I finally gave up, you know, the old dog that really can't learn these new tricks, and came back to the typewriter. The Olivetti still makes an office typewriter. Oh, this is a picture by Everett Raymond Kinsler. I'm always in a white suit, you see, so Ray Kinsler did one of me in a charcoal gray suit for my birthday, and I love it, and so I have that on the wall. Anything about myself is only on the wall of my study. I think it's a little Oh, I have, my wife has gotten me many wonderful hat posters. There's kind of a hat motif in the apartment. Before I got married and had children, I would start work about 2 in the afternoon and work late into the evening. But once you have children, you get up early. They tell you when you're getting up, not you. I'm fine, thank you. How are things in San Diego? It must be nice and sunny there. I honestly don't remember how many printings. And I'm really happy that it has survived the way it has. This is a history of modern art, and describes how it all became an intellectual fashion, and that how painters began to paint in order to illustrate theories rather than to express what they saw, their individual visual take on life. And the furor over this, saying that they were no longer painting from the inside out, but were painting theories. I predicted even that there would be in the future art shows in which there'd be mainly an explanation of the theory on the wall with a little postcard size print of the picture. The art world went berserk, and of course it was reviewed by art critics who hated the notion, and it was inundated in bad reviews. I mean, it was unbelievable, but it did strike a nerve, and it's being read. I saw in addition to the New York Times Sunday arts section, and there were 3 different reviews making the same point, that these paintings that they were reviewing were all theory and no art. And I had to laugh to seeing that, because that was a prediction come true. And so I ripped off a letter to the New York Times, which had lambasted the book originally, pointing this out, and guess what? It never was printed. But I had fun with that book. I like most to get a new idea out of the air, so to speak, something that's being talked about but has not been written about. And I like it most if it's something I don't know anything about, frankly. I guess that's the journalist in me. And it's always a challenge. It's a journalistic challenge, whether I'm writing a novel or anything else, to penetrate whatever world it happens to be. Oh, such as in Columbus, Ohio, for example, and I did a piece on motorcycle culture, which was a big thing, and Columbus, you know, being the headquarters of Harley Davidson, was right in the center of all that. As a matter of fact, if you have any ideas, I'm looking for one right now as to what would be my next book. You know, it had crossed my mind. I lived in Washington for just almost 3 years when I was working for the Washington Post, and I always felt that this town was not really ever covered in its entirety. What was covered was that quadrant of Washington known as Northwest, plus Capitol Hill and, of course, the White House. And there's a lot more going on in Washington, D.C. right now. When I was on the Post, for example, there was no coverage of the black middle class, and there's a big black middle class in Washington. As far as the Post was concerned, the only time you'd be covered if you were black was if you were on welfare. I mean, it was so distorted. But I think there's a great novel to be done about Washington, but it wouldn't be the kind of novel that you've seen so far. That was from The Bonfire of the Vanities. And I saw why Dickens had so much fun giving names to people and to organizations in all of his books. Dunning's Spungett and Leach, and I had a couple of other law firms. Maybe they'll pop back into my mind, but it was fun to do that. As far as doing research on the right stuff, I had gone down to Cape Canaveral for Rolling Stone to do a piece about the scene at the launch of Apollo 17, which was the last mission to the moon. And it turned out to be a reunion of astronauts from all the prior programs, Mercury, Gemini, and so on. And I began to wonder, what is the makeup of a human being who will sit on top of a 35-story rocket? That's how big these Saturn rockets were. I could see it out there on the launch pad, 3 days before. And this little thimble up on top, known as the command module, and I said, who's willing to do this? So I started interviewing astronauts right there in Cape Canaveral during the reunion, and I would ask them questions like, how do you get the courage to do something like that? And they would wince. Courage is one of those words that's taboo among pilots generally. The word death is taboo. You can say unacceptable risk. That's about as close as you can get to the whole subject of the emotion of being willing to hang your hide out on the line every day as military pilots do. So then I found myself traveling all over the country to interview former astronauts and try to get inside of this question: who can do this, and why will they do it? Why will they risk their lives in this in this fashion? And I finally had to make up a name for the phenomenon, and I called it the right stuff. These were people who had the right stuff. And in military flying, your military rank doesn't mean but so much in terms of your reputation. I go by a quota system. I find that I can waste time at my desk with great efficiency. Just as I can be just as efficient wasting time at my desk as I would be window shopping. So I said, once I've got the material, first I have to get all the material and do an outline. Once I have done that, I will set myself a quota of 10 triple-space pages a day. That's about 1,300 words. And when I finish, I'll finish often in the middle of a sentence. I just close up shop, and that's it. I don't have to work anymore that day. But often it drags on much longer, and I still have to finish the pages. But that's the only thing that works for me. Well, it happened to me once. I had the flu, and I was in a very stuffy restaurant with some friends, and I figured I need some air. I was really feeling bad. So I walked out the front door of the restaurant and fainted. I think it was the cold air suddenly hitting me. And I was ended up down on the sidewalk. I was out until I could feel something pushing against my ribs. It was the door, this glass door. And so I looked up, and here were these two people trying to get out of the restaurant. And I'm lying on the sidewalk, and it was these two men. The first one says, "Are you okay?" And I wanted to say, "Yeah, I'm fine. I always take a little rest on the sidewalk after I've had a meal." But I was too weak to even say anything. So finally, they said, "Oh, well, good." And they pushed the door far enough, I had to slide my body a bit until they got out. And that was it. That, I must say, got me angry enough so that I got a little spurt of adrenaline, was able to get up off the sidewalk and finally go home. I don't know whether that's a city phenomenon. Probably is. People just, in a city, people feel that their lives are so separate from yours. Why get involved? That's been pretty well documented, that the high percentage of faculty members around the country who are from that particular generation, whether they were active protesters or not, that's their take on things. And there has been something of a reign of terror on faculties on the subject of political correctness. And I've talked to a number of professors who've been through this, and they said, you know, every professor, if there's a graduate school attached to the university, prides himself on having some top students under his wing in graduate school. But all it takes to keep students away from a particular professor is simply to whisper behind the hand, well, you can be under his wing if you want to, but if I were you, and then roll the eyeballs, and most students will say, gee, I guess there's something wrong here. It's probably, and as you say, it's those radical, or at least very liberal professors are students from back in the 60s. They are of age now to run faculties. And, you know, at Harvard, for example, there are very, very few professors like Harvey Mansfield, who is now a famous professor of government there and very popular. But he has, I think it's only the fact that he has tenure and a reputation that would save his skin there. Recently, Harvey Mansfield, there's a great pressure in all the universities today to inflate students' grades, because so many are going off to some form of graduate school, whether it's law school or medical school, but it'll be something. And so if they don't have very good grades, they may not get in. And so the custom of inflated grades is now very widespread. So Harvey Mansfield now gives 2 grades. One goes to the registrar, and Harvard students today are guaranteed a B+. That's going to be the lowest grade given at Harvard. He gives them 2 grades, one for the registrar and one for the student. Nobody else has to ever see what this second grade is. But you know, he may get the automatic B+, and his real grade may be C-, because he feels like, I've got to let you know the truth so that you will not think that you are any sort of star at academics. The Right Stuff had turned out to be a pretty decent movie, so I wasn't worried when the Bonfire of the Vanities was taken over as a movie project, and I must admit, I cashed the check. And the two producers, who are well-known producers, Peter Guber and John Peters, left the project to take over Columbia Pictures at Sony. Sony by now owned Columbia. And so there was really nobody at the controls. And they had sent the property to a number of directors who would be logical choices, like Mike Nichols, Sidney Lumet, who, for whatever reason, were not available. And then they gave it to Brian De Palma, who is best known for, well, rather violent movies like Scarface, for example. And but I have sympathy for what happened in his case. They said it had to be done in 2 hours, because the conventional wisdom was that you can't make money on a movie that can't be shown twice in the evening. So he has to do this incredible speed up of the movie, I mean, of the story, and it just wasn't. It simply wasn't possible to do it. And as you will remember, if you'll remember, Tom Hanks was the star. He played Shaman Brian, as you pronounce it, Shaman McCoy. And later on, it was such a bad movie that later on, I'd never met Tom Hanks, but I was in a restaurant. Tom Hanks came over, and he says, I just wanted to apologize for what they did to your movie, or what we did to your movie. Well, he had just won an Oscar for Philadelphia. And I said, well, I see you're getting better scripts now. And he left. He seems to be a very nice guy. Absolutely the wrong person to pick for that apart because they had bought this property and they had, oh my God, we have a hero here who's a philanderer, he's arrogant, he's born with a silver spoon in his mouth. How can we make him likable? Well, we'll choose an actor as likable as Tom Hanks. Well, then you've got another story, you see. What I've noticed more than anything else is that one half of the old prescriptions or purposes of an American college has been dropped. It used to be that colleges, it's just an American phenomenon. Colleges existed to give undergraduates a broad general knowledge of everything from the arts to the sciences, so that throughout their lives, when new information or new subjects come up in these areas, they have a context in which to deal with them. But the other part of the mission of the American college was to create character, to build character. Character is a word that has vanished from American campuses. So is the word virtue. It's just gone. Many people with university education today are uncomfortable with the words good and evil. I mean, I can't tell you how many writers, journalists, people that I hung around with were just appalled that Ronald Reagan would use a term like the evil empire, and the idea being, how can you go around calling things evil? Everybody knows that everything is always relative. What's evil for one society is good for another. Character, building character also used to include patriotism as well as religious devotion. Patriotism is much out of fashion among, I think it's probably both students and faculty. It's not that they're unpatriotic, it's that it's considered a social gaffe to act patriotic. So if I really want to shake up my confreres, and after all, so many of my friends are journalists and writers, I will wear one of those. I wish I'd worn it today, Brian. One of those American flag pins in the lapel. I have one that has two flags, and I find if I walk into a room in this particular world of journalists and so on with that, it's as if people shrink. It's as if I've held a cross up to a bunch of werewolves, you know. And it's a really funny phenomenon. Again, they're not unpatriotic, but it's become a fashion that that to be patriotic is somehow to be simple, a bit simple-minded, because the world doesn't work that way. Every culture is equal to every other culture, which is, I think, a foolish way to look at life. If you don't think your own culture is the best, I think it's time to get cracking and make it the best. Oh, gee, I'm not really anxious for that to for that to transpire. I would have to give away a lot of secrets. No, nothing would make a headline, but if people saw how much I worry while I'm writing, you know, several times I've had the opportunity for documentary filmmakers to follow me around and for my daily life. There is nothing more boring than a writer's daily life if he's writing. And if you're out in the field doing some reporting, it ruins your reporting stint for somebody being there with a camera. But I would start off just reading all the books, I guess, because there are certain themes that recur again and again. One of which being the importance as a human motivation of the whole idea of status, social status. I discovered that in the works of Max Weber, who really put the term into the language in the current definition. back in the early part of the 20th century. I arrived in graduate school with the typical liberal arts student contempt for the social sciences, for sociology and anthropology and all this sort of thing. As soon as I took some courses, I became an absolute convert. And I really do think that it'll be possible eventually to isolate in the brain some center that keeps tabs moment to moment on one's status in the world. Not necessarily that you're trying to get greater, but most of it's just protecting what you've got. And that started my interest in neuroscience. And back in 1957, when I finally finished graduate school. And they're closing in neuroscience on such specific things as that. Yes, I have Charlotte taking a neuroscience course from a Nobel Prize winner, as a matter of fact. And I do think neuroscience is changing, gradually changing the human view of the human's view of himself. I think part of it has to do, when I was talking about the whole business of character. A liberal arts education, well, the term liberal arts, for a start, has always intrigued me. I always said to myself, why do they call them liberal arts? Why do they call them arts at all? It turns out the word liberal in that sense is derived from Roman times, when the word liber meant free. Also meant book, but I don't think there was any real connection there. Not even on book notes or anything. But, and the liberal arts were subjects that could be taught only to free men. As you know, the Romans had every type of slave you can imagine, including Greeks. There are many Greeks slaves who did great things in Rome. But the slave was never allowed to take a course in a subject which would give you would magnify your ability to persuade people. They could take engineering, they could take all sorts of practical courses, but they could not take philosophy, theology, history, rhetoric, or any of the subjects that would enable them to come up with theories that might endanger the entire system. And built into all this was that religion and theosophy are also part of the theology, rather. And so now, as you very correctly state, the attitude of students is much more practical. And there was a time in the 1980s when Wall Street was as hot as it's ever been in its history, that the figure I saw was something like almost 40% of students in the Ivy League colleges were aiming towards investment banking, which means you take a lot of economics courses, and economics is fine, but it pretty much rules out the liberal arts. And these are the arts of persuasion, and a lot of which involves religion. This came out in 1976, and that was my overdose on long titles. It was so long, and most people, including myself, didn't know whether to call it mauve or mauve. And I figured they'd come into a store and say, well, I'd rather make a fool of myself in front of the clerk, I'll get something else. But I don't know. Still to this day, I don't know. I think you probably use either one. That's about, it's similar to the painted word, is about the history of contemporary architecture, which I must confess was a bit mocking of what's being done today. I happen to have been at Stanford, this surely by chance, when there was a reunion, the 30th anniversary of the radical movement of 1969, in which there was some violence, and I think some destruction of buildings at Stanford and so on. In any case, it was the high point of the movement. And so mostly the radicals of that era reconvened, and the purpose of the conference was to reassess what they had achieved or not achieved in their in the protest movement. It was quite something visually, because they looked just the same as they looked in 1969, except the ponytails were now gray and the beards were gray. And what struck me was that they had invited the current student activists to present to them an account of what they were doing on campus today. And the only cause that was live at that time, this is of course before 9/11, before Iraq and all these things, was a movement protesting the low wages of the caterers who supplied the cafeterias, not the low wages of employees of Stanford, but of the caterers. And the radicals of '69 looked at them with jaws dropping. This is a cause? They couldn't believe that there was so little that they had found to protest about. Of course, the tenor of the faculty and, as you say, the student body was quite. The tenor was a liberal tenor, but you would know better than I just how pervasive it might have been. I always felt that the majority of the students were not paying attention in any close way to radical or the politically correct agenda of so much of the faculty. Today, they are much influenced by what you did in the 1960s. The wall of formality separating student and teacher is gone. The formality of dress is gone, not only among students, but among faculty. There's so many faculty members today who want to be called by their first name. You know, well, Ted, that struck me as a bit odd. You know, from the '60s came the music that students listen to today. It all started with the Beatles. Well, you could maybe give Elvis a nod, and Bill Haley in the comments perhaps, but it really started with the Beatles, who seem very tame today, but it all led eventually to heavy metal and things of that sort. I think students today are living out the legacy of the 1960s. Now, I was saying that there is no strong political, at least I didn't run into any really strong political currents on the campus or the activist side. But just wait, if any president institutes a draft, you will see an uprising such as never before occurred. It'll make Vietnam look like a game of checkers. But don't worry, no president's going to do that, because they all know it would be absolute suicide to do it. Iraq is the first thing in a long time around which students could very easily mobilize. I did not. I was A1, that's the top rank all through 1A. I was kind of A1 too. No, I was 1A and was never called. I was in graduate school, which gave me some exemption, but that was during the war in Korea. I read the New York Post, to be honest. We always get the Times and the Post, and the Post is so much easier to get into. Things like scalp grandma, then rob her. I love that headline, scalp grandma, then rob her. It's the missing subject that gets you. Like, what fiends have done this? It makes you, and it's a dying fall also, scalp grandma, then rob her. The next line should be, then leave all the lights on in her kitchen. But I don't listen to much music, but it's most likely to be country music. What I really liked has always been country. Oh, in the 60s, I had a second childhood and really enjoyed a lot of the music of the 60s. But I grew up with songs like, I heard the wreck on the highway, but I didn't hear nobody pray. I still like that song. Yeah. It would be whatever's showing when I'm getting undressed at night, probably Nightline or CNN or Fox. I'll just try to pick up the news on television. Because I worked on morning newspapers, this meant I would go to work at 2 in the afternoon and get off around 11. I missed television. And my daughter, who went to a very difficult high school, never got into the habit either. She would insist on watching Beverly Hills 90210. It came on once a week, and that was it. There may be a connection there with the fact that she's also a terrific writer. I mean, it's great to see her, and she has downtime. She's reading. Technically, yes, but they're in this case, there's only one professor at all of Harvard who does this, and in his way, he is trying to build character in the sense of saying, look, face it, this is what you really accomplished in this course, and why are we kidding you? And that is one of the ways of not teaching character. If you don't let anybody fail, if you don't let anybody know that they've done just outright, you've done terribly. I think you're not building character at all. It was, the title story is about the surfers who had communes out in California. The rest of it is more pieces mainly about the 60s. To be completely honest, I don't know. I never was able to figure out the word. I suppose one could be an existentialist and not know it. Oh, I rode on that bus many times. I began in 1966. Ken Kesey was a best-selling, marvelous, very talented novelist who had written One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is a classic. I mean, that will never go out of print. He then wrote Sometimes a Great Notion, which was about the Oregon lumber country. And he then went into this, he had gone into the Stanford creative writing program under Wallace Stegner, another great novelist. And while there, he met a psychiatrist at a government medical facility, and they were experimenting at that time with the drug LSD, which was believed to be a drug that would cause you to simulate schizophrenia, and was being used as such. And Kesey, like many people in that era, began to believe that LSD actually opened the doors of perception, to use a phrase from Aldous Huxley, and enabled your mind to see and perceive things that it would not be able to perceive without these drugs. The others were, you know, psilocybin and mescaline and peyote and so on. Eventually they found out that the opposite is true. The reason you hallucinate with LSD is that it blocks so many channels in your brain that you're desperately trying to create a picture a rational picture of what's going on. So you dredge up all sorts of memories and you're trying to fit them in. That's what the hallucination consists of. But he started a movement. He had a group called the Merry Pranksters, and his real mission was to turn on the world through events that he called the acid tests, in which he would mix LSD into the Kool-Aid, and people, large groups, would drink well, an LSD cocktail, in essence. Well, the caller mentioned La Honda. La Honda is a small town in the mountains south of San Francisco, down towards, I guess, Santa Cruz. And he had a rather, you might call it, expanded log cabin. That's where the pranksters live. He died, I think it was just 2 years ago. And he, by my light, was pretty young. I think the premise of your question is quite correct. The first point I would make is that the internet does one thing and only one thing. It retrieves and disseminates information faster than it's ever been possible before. But it does not change the human brain. It does not change the culture all by itself. But it has become the main way that children born after 1980 get their information. In no small part because it's so fast. But often forgotten is that the book is a form of technology itself, and it's not that old. Printed books hardly exist in any real volume before the early 1800s. So this is something. It's something new, and only in printed pages can you really explain anything. It's very difficult under current technology to read for a long time on the internet. For one thing, the screen is backlit, and another thing that people don't seem to realize is that the computer is very backward in one sense. It scrolls. You know, if you want to move ahead or move backwards on the screen, you're scrolling away. And the monks were so happy to get rid of scrolls way back in the 16th century. Scrolls were driving them crazy. And I must say, I have used the computer, but it drives me crazy to have to scroll like that. But all the newspapers and magazines are keenly aware of the fact that young people born after 1980, are doing their reading on the internet. The newspapers are terrified. There is a great book to be written about the whole world of horses and breeding and all the rest of it. A side of it that's little known, people know about horse racing, but there's also the horse show circuit, and people will often pay more money for a jumper, a horse that can perform well on the show circuit, than they'll pay for a racehorse. And also these horses often are bigger if they're going to jump over. So that's a good area of study. I think they were very sincere. Kesey used as his text not any sort of Eastern mystical literature like the Bhagavad Gita or anything of that sort. He used superhero comic books, for example, but I do believe that he honestly felt that he had found God, whom he called Cosmo. He was smart enough not to make himself sound like just any other revivalist. And many of the people in that movement would refer to God as the manager. And I remember seeing a fellow sitting out in the middle of Broadway in San Francisco, and this blissful look on his face, the wonder he wasn't run over, saying, I've met the manager and I'm in the pudding. I've met the manager, I'm in the pudding. And the pudding was referred to this state of ecstasy that so many religions have started with, like the whirling dervishes achieved it through dancing. Apparently Muhammad achieved it through sensory deprivation by just praying and thinking in the darkness of caves. And signs that the Hindu movement started with a drug called homa water. Early Christians apparently used wine for the same purpose, because as one of St. Paul's letters, I forget whether it's the Ephesians or the Corinthians, in which he says, look, if this thing that we've discovered and are now a part of means anything, we should be able to do it without drinking all this wine. And of course that wine persists in communion today. You mean the title piece, which was called Hooking Up. Actually, I have never aimed anything I've written at any particular audience. I've written the kind of things that I would like to read. And I think it's probably fatal to pick out some audience and say, well, I'm going to aim it in this in this direction. And I could be wrong, but I think the young readers, most of my books can be read by the intelligent 12-year-old, and I have the feeling that a lot of them are doing it. First of all, I gave a little account, lexicological account of how it's used for every single part of speech: noun, verb, adverb, adjective, interjection. I did constantly, and not only from boys but from girls, and that really startled me, I must say. And I wrote that little essay early in the game so that people would not read this and say, oh, he's trying to be shocking and spicy by using this word over and over. And the message I was giving is it is used over and over and over, so that it's used it's always been used by boys, but it's used much more today than it ever was before. And also now it's used by women just the same way boys do. And that to me was, oh, I heard it, sure. No, I mean, when I went to, say, fraternity parties, they were beyond clamming up. No, I didn't. Actually, it probably would have been a great asset. You know, she looks much younger than I do, and I think she'd have been a hit, but I never thought of doing that. He was the one Mercury astronaut who was no longer living, so I never had a chance to talk to him. I talked to his wife at great length, and also read her book about her husband. And possibly possibly my treatment was unfair, but I don't really think so. Gus Grissom was the astronaut who lost the Mercury capsule after he had landed in the water. And he claims that the hatch on the capsule simply blew, so water came pouring in, and he had to get out, which would indicate, well, that would be a perfectly believable way it happened, except afterwards they tried to test that another capsule in every way they could to see if that capsule could be made to blow its hatch. They dropped it from great heights, they put it in the water, and so on. Also, his heart rate had gone up higher than any astronaut's. If the rule was if an astronaut's heart rate reached 180, they would abort the mission. Now, heart rates don't necessarily have all that importance, but it's at least an indication of someone feeling tremendous stress. And the speculation always was that he had hit there was a sort of plunger you could hit inside the capsule to blow the hatch open in case you need to get out rapidly. And they kind of downplayed his achievement afterwards because of that. Instead of being met at, when he came back from his mission by President Kennedy, he was met by Lyndon Johnson, which was just not quite the same thing. Yes, that was, it must have been 67. Don't hold me to that. That was to be Apollo 1. It's entirely possible that it put the idea into my mind, although I don't I don't really remember that happening. I'm a tremendous admirer of my namesake, Thomas Wolfe, and Only the Dead Know Brooklyn. It's just a classic story that only Thomas Wolfe could have written. So I wouldn't put it past me to pick up a notion like that from him, and then to handle it in a slightly different way. But I don't have any recollection of the library. Well, I use it the way anybody else would use a library. I have a large collection of things that have caused me to start off on reading jags. For example, I have a lot of books on neuroscience. I'm fascinated by neuroscience. Although the actual library that I usually use is down just a block away. It's called the General Society Library, which is this great small library. I've never run into him there, although I've run into him here and there. We are about the same age, and we were all struggling reporters at the same time. Well, just thinking off the top of my head, there are a number of illustrators in journalism who I'm friendly with, like Jim McMullen, Milton Glaser. Clay Felker, who was the founder of New York Magazine, is one of my close friends. I do also have friends outside of that particular world, like one of my very closest friends is Counselor Eddie Hayes, who is a very colorful criminal lawyer who's now branched out into other areas. Eddie once told me that, he said, criminal law is one of the few careers in which the better you are, the worse type of human being you meet. He said, because only drug dealers and mafia can afford to pay for big trials and all this sort of thing. And another old friend who's meant a great deal to me is a doctor in Buffalo, Jim Nolan, whom I happened to have roomed with when I was in graduate school at Yale. Yeah. You also mentioned Marcel Duchamp. And I think it's probably true that Marcel Duchamp, the old Dadaist, who, as you say, presented an ordinary urinal made by Crane, whoever made it, as an art object, and Andy Warhol, who never did an original image in his life, have had enormous influence on today's young artists, or serious artists as they would be known. Today it is considered meretricious, false, to paint pictures from out of your imagination, because that's just a trick that you're foisting off, and that it's just, after all, it's just a piece of canvas with pigment on it, and it becomes a mistake for your hands to, we talk about in terms of reputation, to touch anything that you present as art. So that's why there's so many things like installation art, where you just put a lot of furniture and this and that object in the corner of a room, and that becomes an art object. Oh, you get a block of ice. You get 3 blocks of ice with different colored water frozen, and you put this on a wall and you let it drip down onto a canvas, and what results is the work of art. But it's no question that Warhol, who, as I say, never did an original image in his life, has had an enormous influence on painters, sculptors, everybody since his death. If you include Ambush at Fort Bragg, I guess it would be 487. Man in Full was 1998. Of course, this one's 2004. I would prefer to have it 2005. It hasn't been working out that way for me. You know, Zola, who is my idol, Émile Zola, berated himself for doing only 25 novels in 28 years. And you think about it, you think of the great novelist who was so prolific. Just as Balzac wrote so fast, they couldn't serialize his work. He was writing 3 books a year from age 30 to age 51. He was fueled on caffeine. He drank coffee all day long, and he found that breakfast would dilute the effect of the coffee, so he'd eat plums all day, drink coffee, and eat plums and write. And then after his writing stint was over, which might be 4 or 5 in the morning, he'd have this huge meal. This is not recommended by doctors, I think, to drink coffee all day and then have a huge meal. I do. I must confess, you're not supposed to confess that, I think Starbucks coffee is fabulous. But I don't have but 1 cup. I have that in the morning after breakfast. No, never have smoked. Those old guys. Anyway, the question of what is considered literature within literary circles, the so-called literary world, has changed since the first half of the 20th century. In the first half of the 20th century, that was the great era of the American novel, in my opinion. It started in 1900 with Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie. It goes on up through Dos Passos, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Sinclair Lewis, our first Nobel Prize winner in literature, Richard Wright, Zora Neale Hurston, Edith Wharton. It's just one great writer after another. It culminates with John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath in 1939. This brought American literature to the attention of the entire world for the first time. These were all writers of realistic novels and who had a great urge to somehow take all of the American experience and put it down on paper. They may have been cynics, they often were. They may have been very dubious about the American experience, and quite a few were dubious about it. But they just had this great thirst, this hunger to just get it all down on paper. So after this amazing triumph, now American literature is known, respected all over the world. I mean, Dos Passos was completely the model for Sartre's 3 novels, which are really actually quite good, which were about the Second World War. Afterwards, after the Second World War, suddenly these literary circles that we're talking about became Francofied, I guess. They became French fried, to tell you the truth. They bought into the French notion that the only real literature is the nuanced psychological novel, and that you really shouldn't dig your hands into all this dirt of social life and slums and all this rather sordid realism. It's astounding what took place. Well, let me get to your second question: what advice would I give a novelist? Because I can only give advice according to my experience and my theories. I would say move heaven and earth to get a job on a newspaper or to start writing for a magazine. I honestly feel that the first thing to do is to learn how to go out into the world and get new material. Now, there's nothing wrong at all. I mean, you know, do it. Write a first novel out of your own experience. Many great young writers have done that. And Emerson said every person on earth has a great autobiography to write, if only that person can figure out what is unique about his own experience. But he didn't say everyone on earth has 2 great autobiographies to write. And there are so many writers today who cannibalize the first 25 years of their lives, write a terrific novel. Then the second novel is about a young novelist who had terrific reviews but really didn't get much money out of his book, and now he's walking wearily up the stairs of a 5-story walk-up to get to his apartment. This novel is really not all that interesting. The writer's angst is not the hottest topic in the world. 19th century novelists, early 20th century novelists understood you get out of the house. Steinbeck, to write The Grapes of Wrath, bought a truck, an old truck, put in some food and some blankets, and started touring these migrant labor camps in California, and eventually came up with this incredible book, The Grapes of Wrath, about people and a subject of which he knew nothing at the beginning. What happens to white suits is that eventually they turn yellow, which is too bad. And I found the only ones that really will last in a white condition, this is flannel. We're on the subject now, is flannel and silk. But if you get gabardine, and I've done that, if you get almost any other cloth, it's going to turn yellow. Also, they eventually are going to get dirty beyond repair. You have to be dedicated to this. It started in 1962 when I arrived in New York. And, oh my God, am I that old? It's 42 years, I guess. Be 75 in March. Chuck Yeager was or remains, one of those unusual human beings who is the same in any setting that you put him. As somebody being interviewed, as somebody on a talk show, or somebody just sitting at home chewing the fat, he is someone so confident that he never feels the slightest need to change his personality. I first met him when he was the head of the safety command for a big section of the western United States. And I had an appointment with him, and he was an hour and a half late because he had to go up to Northern California and investigate a crash in which a pilot had died. And so when he came in, I said to him, gee, I'm really sorry to hear about that pilot's death. And he said, oh, you give those boys the planes, and they're gonna crack them up. He said. I mean, the death in the world, in the flying fraternity, is such a constant that he was pretty inured to it. And if you see the number of hours that Chuck Yeager has flown high-performance jets, it's just astounding. The last time I spoke to him, he was still flying Mach 2 in F-104s. He, of course, had a big ego, but you have to do what he has done. You really, it's very hard to be a shrinking violet. When I first met him, he assumed I was an aviation writer, and just couldn't believe I didn't really know what ailerons did or what hydraulic controls were. He was very patient about it, though. I had a long interview with him in San Bernardino and visited his where he lived up in Grass Valley, and I called him any number of times just to check out facts and so forth when I was writing. He was always very patient, very gracious, and he knew by this time an awful lot of aeronautical engineering. He had become a real expert in that area. I usually would just go into a certain milieu. For example, I had an hypothesis when I started doing The Right Stuff about the astronauts, and this was based upon the first article that had been written by the two psychiatrists who were assigned to study the astronauts, because at the beginning nobody knew really what it was going to take to fly in space. And this article pointed out that all 7 of the Mercury astronauts were first sons. 4 of them, in fact, were named Junior, Junior after their names. They were all from small towns. They were all from very stable families, and somehow this added up to courage, heroism in the air. And that was my hypothesis, because I fit the picture pretty much, except I wasn't flying anything. I mean, except for the small town part. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. Well, by doing research, I discovered that none of those things was really pertinent. They were mostly born in the Depression years where the birth rate dropped to 2 per family, slightly less actually. So if you can work it out on paper in a second. If you're a son at all, born in, let's say, 1930 as I was, or 1931 or 2, you have 2 out of 3 chances you're a first son because of the low birth rate. The small towns meant nothing because so many of them were the sons of military personnel who would be, the families had moved from here to here to here to there. That was of no consequence. It turned out that these stable families weren't as stable as everyone had assumed. Scott Carpenter, for example, there was a lot of turmoil in his family. He was brought up by a grandfather. It turned out that Deke Slayton, had been divorced. And in those days, it's hard to believe now, but having had a divorce was a terrible stain on a military record, and it could cost you your future. That all changed after 1970 for some. So the real key to whatever they had, I called it the right stuff, was the fact that they were now members of this brotherhood. I called it the brotherhood of the right stuff. It all came out of the circumstances and the code of being a pilot. Today there are lots of really hot Hispanic pilots in the Air Force, and it's all a matter of the culture of military flying, and not all these other things. I think it's one of the, maybe scandals is too strong a word. It is too strong a word, but one of the great failures of American journalism has come about through external forces. Specifically, newspapers. There used to be many more newspapers in this country. Practically every place in America, the newspapers have shook out that into local monopolies. There's no national monopoly, but it's very rare that there's any competition among newspapers. As a result, there isn't as much reporting. You've got 2 newspapers and you've got one zoning hearing to cover. Why send 2 reporters? Just send one. He can, material will be used by both newspapers. Now that, without competition, reporters don't work nearly as hard as they do with competition. When I first arrived in New York, there were 7 newspapers. So I knew every time I went out, there was somebody else covering the same story. And if I didn't do a great job, I was going to look like a fool the next morning, and everybody would know it. That's just simply no longer true. The second thing is that television news gets, I would say, 95% of its information from newspapers. Just watch a television show sometime and see how much of it comes from newspaper coverage. When television news tries to break a story, they almost always get it wrong. It's like the Dan Rather coverage coverage of these bogus letters concerning George Bush's service in the Air National Guard. Incidentally, Rather has very little to do with it, except that he was apparently all for the story. The television news is dominated by people who are names that almost never in the press. These are the producers. I guess Don Hewitt of 60 Minutes. Now that is a good repertorial show. Is the only one who is well known. I mean, Rather has been a voice box, sort of like a linotype operator on the newspaper. The voice box converts something written by other people, script writers for the show, into a form that is immediately, easily consumed by the viewer. In England, they're very frank about this. They call them news readers. In a sense, the information is coming from newspapers, and the newspapers are reporting less. I would say there is less news reported today than there was in the 1920s or the 1930s in this country. Although, because of television news seems so vivid that we don't recognize this happening. If it is perceived that way, there's not too much I can say about it. I can't say you really didn't perceive it that way. Let's think again. And if so, it's a shortcoming. But having admitted that much, I agree with you that there should be, as was constantly done by Zola, an intersection of the social, let's say the social pressures on somebody are on a horizontal plane, and the psychological makeup of the human being, which is often influenced by the social position, is on a vertical plane. The ideal result is that the two are blended perfectly, and you really understand the whole creature. And if I've failed to do that with any characters, then let's face it, I failed. But I have tried to reach that perfect ideal. You mean, has there been a change in the generations? I'm not completely sure what you mean, but an awful lot changed right there in the 1960s. And of course, Kerouac was the precursor of Ken Kesey and the Mary Pranksters and all the rest of it. A lot of it, I think, had to do with the fact that suddenly there was, in the 60s, for the first time in a very long, since the 20s really, there was enough money in the air for young people to live on their own terms, just as Kerouac did, just as Neil Cassidy did, just as Kesey and the Pranksters did, just as the Pump House Gang surfers did. This was something new in American American life, and at the same time, the old order, this is my theory, had lost its religious commitment. A professor at Stanford told me he knew when the old order had crumbled. It was in this year, 1969, of the real activist peak at Stanford, and he saw a professor of history, a very well-known man, a big man, probably 52 or 3 years old. He was giving a talk, and suddenly a protester leapt on stage, took the microphone away from him, and began a harangue to the crowd. And this professor who was telling me about this said, I watched the history professor waiting to see what he would do. I assumed that he would grab that microphone back and order the young man off the stage. He said, instead, he just stepped back a couple of steps and let the young man have his rant. He said, in the old days, that would have never happened. In the old days, when there was real religious commitment among faculty, or just simply academic commitment, that would not have occurred. And I think an awful lot of people and institutions gave way and faced with the terrific moral commitment of activists in that period. It is a great area to go into. I don't think it is so much sweeping the world as being discovered. It has been, for one thing, unfashionable for journalists in this country to dwell on religious phenomena, and almost to the point of it being sort of some kind of social blunder. But I did write a piece called The Me Decade and the Third Great Awakening, and this must have been back around 1970 1985 or so. I don't remember the year. And the me decade part became reasonably well known. It grew into the idea of the me generation. But the third Great Awakening wasn't paid much attention to. And that referred to the number of new religions that had been forming in this country among young people. Everything from the Est, if you remember that, it was a kind of a therapy movement that had religious undertones, to the growth of Jehovah's Witnesses. I'd always thought of Jehovah's Witnesses as sort of the proverbial old ladies in tennis shoes coming around handing out literature. Not at all. Many, many young people were swelling the ranks of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And these things were generally going on beneath that dividing line of this country of those who have a bachelor's degree from a four-year college and those who don't. But I feel that most of that has always been here. It just was not observed by the media, and that's why this phrase, the Christian right, has always amused me, because it's not a Christian right, it's not a religious right, it's just religious people, and they've always been here in a country like this. Brian, thank you so much, and I don't know if I consider it, well, I can call it an honor to be on the last edition of this particular wonderful show of yours, but whether I can justifiably do that or not, I feel honored, and I thank you.